Hi, I'm Amanda Cottage, and this is Marissa Lake, and we are discussing the issue of is it ethical to perform scientific research on human volunteers. So the first thing we're going to look at is the background information, and that is what is considered to be ethical. And the proper definition of ethical is something that has moral values or something like that. Also, the volunteers are often volunteering for biomedical research, which is like cancer treatment or unknown diseases. And then the privacy rule plays a really big part in the background of what researchers are allowed to do with participants. And it was created due to discrimination of people sharing tissue specimen. Researchers were sharing it with each other, and the participants were getting angry with it.
Okay, and a little bit about why we're even debating this is because volunteers often risk their life for scientific advancement. Sometimes volunteers get injured or even result in death when working with scientific research. So the safety and the well-being of volunteers is a very big question in biology and in science on whether it is ethical to have these volunteers in research for scientific advancement, or if we should not have them and make it more ethical so we don't harm volunteers.
The first that we're going to look at is why it is ethical to perform scientific research on volunteers. So the first main reason is the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB board. The second reason is it helps to save lives. And the third reason is that they are volunteers. The first thing we will look at is the IRB board. So you might be wondering, what is the IRB board? The IRB board is a board that regulates experiments to make sure that if they are ethical or not. They put laws into place like the privacy rule so participants are safe, and they protect participants' rights so in case they're injured or mistreated, they would take authority on that. Another reason is that it would be ethical is that it saves lives. And what it means is that types of things that could save lives with is cancer or tuberculosis or other diseases like that. It helps you with treatments. Doctors can try new treatments of cancer, or they can try new prescriptions, and you can try it out. And also volunteers. So people, you might be wondering, why volunteer? A reason you would volunteer is for money, to help a family member, or you might just have a really big passion for finding out new things in the medical field. So that is why someone might volunteer. Also, we're going to look at what is a volunteer. And a volunteer is a person who volunteers themselves. So they're going in knowing what the causes and effects are of it and the pros and cons. And the volunteers are not forced to do anything, as taken from the Bosman, Slade, and Hirsch in 2009. So you're not forced to do anything. It's just that they volunteer to do it, so they know what they're getting themselves into.
Okay, so it's actually unethical to perform scientific research on volunteers, and here's why. The first thing is that researchers don't always follow the IRB's rules. There are a lot of rules, and researchers might not always follow them so they can get scientific advancement and not really care about the volunteers as much. Also, volunteers can be harmed in scientific experiments. Like I said before, volunteers can get injured, have birth defects, or potentially even die during these research experiments. And also, researchers can deceive their volunteer subjects because the researchers are much more advanced in knowing what they're doing with the research, and the volunteer might just agree to be in the research but not really know what's going on. So for the first part, researchers do not follow the IRB rules. From a website written by Angel in 2015, he said that researchers conduct unethical experiments for scientific advancement. And the reason they do this is because it might be the quickest way to get their scientific research done. For example, if you wanted to study like a disease and get a vaccine for it, a researcher might just inject their volunteer with the disease, but that would be unethical, but they would get quicker results and it would be easier for them to research the disease and create a vaccine. However, that would be unethical because the volunteer would be harmed. So basically, some researchers think that scientific advancement is more important than the volunteers themselves because it's for the greater good and more people will benefit from like a vaccine than a few people getting injured or hurt from the research. Also, researchers do not follow the IRB rules because sometimes they don't accurately report serious adverse events, or SAEs. Now, what are SAEs? SAEs are anything that can seriously harm the volunteer for a long period of time. And that could be birth defects, hospitalization, or even death, or just a few. And this deceives new volunteers not to worry, because if new volunteers look at the researchers' old reports and think that they've never had any serious adverse events, then they might think they're safe and the researcher conducts ethical experiments, while in reality the researcher doesn't conduct ethical experiments and they're just deceiving the volunteer and putting them in a bad place. And the BMC actually did a report on inaccurate reporting of SAE statistics, and they looked at 300 clinical trials and found that 13% of these clinical trials, the researchers didn't report any SAEs at all. So if they're not reporting any SAEs at all, then what else aren't they reporting, and why aren't they reporting this? Are they trying to show that there are some serious adverse events and they're just trying to hide it? Because that's very suspicious. 2% mentioned there was no SAEs, which is pretty reasonable because some clinical trials might not be harming their patients at all. And then 34% incorrectly reported the number of SAEs. Now, if 34% incorrectly reported the number of SAEs, there's usually two reasons. They either don't know how to do it, which is very scary because the researcher should know how to do everything, especially since they're handling the well-being of a human subject, or they're trying to hide the fact that there's more serious adverse events than they wanted to report. So either way, they're deceiving the volunteers, and the volunteers being deceived and the researchers not following the rules and potentially harming their volunteer subjects is very unethical. Second part, volunteers are actually harmed in experiments. Also from Angel into 2015, volunteers have been harmed for years. In the past, there have been Nazi experiments on Jewish victims. I wouldn't really say volunteers, but the researchers still treated them as subjects and not humans, so they could advance their scientific knowledge. For example, they froze some to death just so they can see how long a Nazi soldier could last in cold water in the Arctic Ocean. And there's also the Willowbrook State School experiment, and in this experiment, it was the Willowbrook State School was a school for the mentally challenged, and researchers infected them with hepatitis so they can research the effects of it, and they said these people would either die from being mentally challenged or die for research, and they chose that they would die for research, and it's not their decision if someone should die or not, so that is very unethical. Now, although that was in the past, people are still dying today in volunteer research. From Shamu and Resnick, written in 2006, the University of Pennsylvania actually was doing gene therapy treatment on an 18-year-old man, and he unexpectedly died from complications. Johns Hopkins University was conducting research, and a 24-year-old woman was killed when she inhaled a toxic substance, so she unexpectedly died from that. And then the University of Rochester, they had a research project where a woman that was 19 unexpectedly died as well during their research project. Now, if you or one of your family members went in to volunteer thinking they were just going to get compensation for money, but they never come out, that is extremely unethical. You would be upset, and you wouldn't want other people volunteering or being put in these situations that are very dangerous. And lastly, researchers deceive the volunteer subjects. From Raznica in 2015, she said that researchers have the upper hand. So basically, the researchers can manipulate their volunteers because they have intellectual advantage or intellectual manipulation. And what this is they know a lot more about the research that they're conducting than the volunteer. So the volunteer kind of just doesn't really know what's going on, and the researcher can manipulate him. And if the researcher manipulates the volunteer, they could possibly hurt them or harm them or do something the volunteer didn't really want to agree to, which is unethical. And an example of this is in the 1960s. There was a vitamin C study that was written in a book by Calero in 2013. And basically what happened was volunteers were the weaker party. Some volunteers volunteered to go to a research facility, and they thought they were getting injected with vitamin C and seeing the health effects on that. When in reality, the researchers injected them with adrenaline and not vitamin C. And since they injected them with adrenaline, that could have potentially caused problems with like heart problems, or any type of biological problems could have happened to these volunteers that they didn't know about. So the fact that these volunteers were injected with an unknown substance that they thought was vitamin C is very unethical, because if the volunteer agrees to be in a research study, they need to know exactly what they are doing, so it is very unethical that they don't know what is going on. So lastly, it's very unethical to perform scientific research on volunteers. Researchers care about knowledge, not volunteers. If they can advance scientifically, they're not going to care about a few human lives. And they also, volunteers unexpectedly die from experiments, which is extremely unethical because every human life is worth the same. And researchers can easily manipulate volunteers, which is unethical because the volunteers should always feel safe and they could possibly be manipulated by these researchers, which is unethical. So in conclusion, should volunteers be allowed to participate in scientific experiments? You've heard both sides on this argument, and you really need to think, is one human life worth more than another for the sake of science? So in the end, the battle of volunteer ethics continues in the world of biology and science, and this battle will continue until we finally figure out, is it ethical to have volunteers in scientific experiments?